Anyone who has grown up in a small Midwestern town knows at the heart of that town is secrets, rumors, and ghost stories. Some are ghost stories told through time to keep little kids in line until they become teenagers and start to press the boundaries of those tall tales. They dare each other to enter that murder house that has stood empty for a lifetime, or walk the dead overgrown train tracks into the tunnel where 6 children were killed by the escaped lunatic. You've heard those stories, you know. However, the whispered rumors among adults that spring from secrets are the ones rarely told. Ever since a surprise and brutal winter blizzard that lasted 3 days dropped 4 feet of snow on him, his 12-year-old daughter, and the town. It was 2 months before the town could clear a path to them, and when they did, a rumor emerged Old Man Johnson starved to death, even after he ate his daughter. Years later, kids started to go up to that cabin, dark and in decay, at night to test their mettle. They would scare themselves into hearing screams of the little girl and the hungry chewing of her flesh as Old Man Johnson fed. The truth is, they both just starved to death, but that's a small Midwestern town for you. The story persisted until one February, during the mildest winter on record. A young man bought Widower Johnson's cabin up in the mountains. He became known as Monster Face among the kids. That moniker will become clear. Because of his inclination to remain secluded, young imaginations ran rampant, and the story of Old Man Johnson was soon forgotten. No one knew anything concrete about Monster Face, but adults can't hold in what gossip they have gathered when they gaggle, and little ears hear everything. Sally heard he was from Chicago. Mr. Bretford said he sold a Chevy pickup to him over the phone, and the transaction was handled by a lawyer. Mr. Bretford was instructed to park the truck by the dealer front doors and leave the keys under the mat on the driver's side after he closed up and went home. The next morning, the truck was gone. The town's one real estate agent, Mrs. Coleman, had a similar experience when she sold Monster Face Old Man Johnson's cabin. It wasn't long that the rumors began. He's a drug dealer on the run. No, he's in witness protection program. I heard the Taliban captured him, and when he wouldn't talk, they did that to him. On and on they went, but when they found out who the real Monster Face was, well, it took some time for that to happen. But that February and through several months, the sleepy town was buzzing with new life. Flatbeds, hauling construction material of wood, shingles, and PVC pipe were hauled up the mountain to the cabin. The only crew that ever went to the cabin was from a solar company out of Springfield to install large panels. While all this was going on, and like clockwork on the last business day of every month, Monster Face would call in his supplies to Mr. Hornbaum. While all this was going on, and like clockwork on the last business day of every month, Monster Face would call in his supplies to Mr. Hornbaum at the general store. Monster Face would then come down in his brand new pickup for his supplies, always toward the end of business, when the storefront sidewalk traffic was light. Mr. Hornbaum was a stickler. He didn't like to stay open 1 minute later than he had to, but he made an exception for Monster Face, because what was more important to Mr. Hornbaum than closing up early was the cash influx he got. Mr. Hornbaum would box up the order, stack it by the door, and wait in his back office. When the bell on the front door fell silent from opening and closing, it was then Mr. Hornbaum would come out. He always found a thick envelope on the counter, always with a little something extra for Mr. Hornbaum's inconvenience. As summer came, this pattern never wavered, and no matter how hot it was, Monster Face wore a hoodie with the hood up to cover his face. He would walk with his head down and never make eye contact. It became a silent game for the kids to try and sneak a peek. On one blistering hot day toward the end of June, little Gracie, a precocious young girl of 8, with her ice cream cone in hand, decided to look. Gracie's mother stops to talk to Peggy, who is in charge of the upcoming July 4th parade, just 2 weeks away. Gracie notices Monster Face loading his supplies. With her mother and Peggy in cheery conversation, her tongue swipes a generous melting glob of creamy goodness, and then walks towards Monster Face as he heads back into the store. Gracie sees him come out with another box and stops very close behind him as he places it on the truck bed. Gracie's tongue swipes at her cone. Monster Face turns and stops quickly before knocking her over. Gracie looks up into the darkness of the hoodie. She not only sees the fearful bright blue eyes wide open stare back, but the true monstrosity above her. Gracie cocks her head with an essence of innocence and not one bit of fear. She asks, "Does it hurt?" Gracie then swipes another lick of ice cream. She extends her treat upwards and says, "This will help." Monsterface blinks, his eyes soften. It is hard to tell and Gracie isn't sure, but she feels he is smiling at her. And she smiles back. It is then she hears the tremor in her mother's voice. "Gracie!" Gracie lowers her tone. Monsterface quickly turns away. He lifts up and slams closed the pickup's gate. He rushes around the truck and gets in. The truck starts just as Gracie's mother reaches her and pulls her daughter close. While the truck slowly pulls away out onto the 2-lane main street, Monsterface looks into his side mirror. Gracie waves as she licks her cone, while her mother's firm hold remains true. That moment was forgotten by Gracie as the 4th of July festivities grew closer. And it wasn't until years later that she would remember that encounter and what it might have meant one fateful day that arrived on July 2nd. The dairy farm Gracie and her family lived on wasn't a big one. They had about a dozen cows and a couple of horses. They rented out for rides during the various carnivals and such. Gracie's older brother, Tommy, who was 13 years old, helped their father with most of the chores, but Gracie would help Tommy the best she could. She would help with feeding the cows and horses with the hay stored in the loft. Afterward, Tommy would go off with his friends and Gracie would sometimes play in the loft while the loft door was open for fresh air. She would sit at her little tea table pretending to have a party with animals. They all had names, of course. Her father told her never to name them, but she secretly did anyway, and she would swear they liked the parties she threw in their honor. That summer day, July 2nd, started off no different than any other for Gracie. Tommy's friend came on their bikes and waited for him to finish his chores. And Gracie stayed to tend to a birthday party for Becky, her favorite cow, but she kept that to herself. Tommy was in a mood because their dad told him to stay and watch his sister while they went to town to make sure everything was set for horse rides. Gracie could hear Tommy's friends groan as he told them he had to stay and her parents drive off. A few minutes later, a loud bang frightened her. Gracie walked to the open loft door to see Tommy light something on the ground and run away. A few seconds later, the loud boom and concussion wave made Gracie jump. Tommy and his friends laughed and pointed at her. Gracie yelled, "That's not funny!" This made them laugh even harder. Now that Gracie knew what it was, she turned and went back to her party. That didn't stop her from being startled every time one went off, though. The cows and horses didn't like it either. She tried her best to ignore the stupid boys as she continued Becky's party. A little while later, she started hearing screeches, and then shortly after, small pops. She knew those were bottle rockets because she had seen them before. After one screech but no pop, Gracie heard Tommy ask, "Where did it go?" Then Gracie heard Steven Johansson, the cutest of Tommy's friends, but she would never admit that out loud, say, "Must be a dud." Gracie soon heard another screech into the air, and then pop. Tommy and his friends were laughing as boys do when they let off fireworks. The fire from the lost bottle rockets started quickly. The dry hay close to the ladder that led down to the barn door burst into flames, and the smoke soon became thick. Their laughter stopped when Tommy and his friends heard Gracie scream as they froze. They could hear the panicked neighs of the horses and the cow's deep bellows. Tommy looked up at the open loft door at Gracie, smoke racing out all around her, and the bright fiery glow growing behind her. Tommy could hear her screams for him to help her through his open, pounding heart in his ears. All he and his friends could do was stand there, watching the horror unfold as the flames took down part of the roof behind Gracie. It only took a matter of minutes for the flames to engulf the barn. Gracie stood there screaming for her brother, as if she was some nightmare specter haunting his dreams. Tommy was never quite sure where Monsterface came from, but he ran so fast past the boys into the raging inferno. The next thing Tommy does remember were the horses racing out of the barn door past him and his friends, and then the cows. No one was ever able to explain how Monsterface got up onto the loft, but Tommy has never forgotten what happened next. The images of Monsterface ripping off his burning hoodie, grabbing the rope, on the pulley system used to raise the bales of hay, tying it around Gracie, lowering her down, and then cutting the rope, are forever seared into his memory. It was then, as Gracie ran to her brother, that the loft collapsed and the fire broke free in its hellish blaze of glory, consuming the barn and Monsterface. A man no one knew saved Gracie's life and her family's livelihood. A man that a town was suspicious of. A man a small Midwestern town didn't trust and made up stories about. It took a day to find Monsterface's remains in the ash heap, and that 4th of July was a somber one for Gracie's family and the town because of their shame, but the festivities and life went on. It wasn't until a few days later that Monsterface's parents came to clear out his cabin, claim his remains, and leave. It was the day before garbage pickup when Tommy and his friends rode up to the cabin to see what was left behind in the trash. What they found there, just on top of a box by the trash cans, was a simple thing, a thing everyone has. It was open to a picture of a young, virtueless shirtless man that any artist would have been pleased to immortalize in granite. His black hair was short, his jawline square, a smile exposing his pearly whites, and his blue eyes seeming to twinkle. Every woman and probably some men who saw this photo of a man in the calendar posed by a Chicago fire truck in his firefighter hat, his pant turnout gear, an axe resting on his shoulder, with the caption, "Sean McHaley, Mr. February," swooned. Monsterface's parents barely made it to the town limits before the whole town knew his story. Sean's father proudly told the mayor how his son was burned badly, saving 2 little boys in an apartment fire. He could no longer do the job he loved, not because he was physically unable, but because of his newfound fear of fire. He needed time alone, and his family understood. But his father was not surprised how his son perished. It doesn't take long for life to overwrite events, even courageous ones, and new stories began to trickle out in whispers when strange things happen. The first story was the widow Crohn's. She had begun to show signs of that insidious disease called dementia. But by the time her son noticed, he had moved away to take a new job. He did what he could to help, but helping at long distance is difficult. Members of the town would check on her from time to time. They knew things had gotten bad when the first chill of fall had come and Mrs. Crone's house burned down. The house was in flames by the time responders arrived. Mrs. Crone had forgotten she was making dinner when she went to bed. They found her looking around in her front yard far away from the raging fire, as if searching for something. A woman came and wrapped a blanket around Mrs. Crone's shoulders. It was then Mrs. Crone asked, "Where's that nice-looking young man with those pretty blue eyes?" Mrs. Crone is long gone. Gracie and I have families of our own now. We have talked about that day many times over the years, about Becky, her favorite cow, and Stephen, who she eventually married. Since that fateful day, our barn burnt down, and Mr. February saved my sister. The town has a new story. Some might call it a ghost story. It is not based on the horror of a heinous act, or a house that has stood empty for generations. I believe it to be true. And only when I arrive on the fire truck with my team to put out fires in the black of night, when a tap on the shoulder, a slight tug on a lock of hair, or their name is shouted in a dream that starts them awake, is it silently acknowledged in the eyes of those wrapped in blankets that they know who rushed in to truly save them? We don't advertise this, but our town has not lost one soul to a fire since Mr. February saved Gracie 30 years ago. We secretly know it is because a little girl showed a man kindness when the rest of us had none, and she gave him the courage to overcome his fear and save her. Also, deep in our hearts, and at the very pit of our souls, we know that the bravest man this town has ever had, and never knew, is still Mr. February.